In my recent video about the Werribee line, I briefly touched on the history of the Geelong and Melbourne Railway Company, the G&MR, who built the railway from Geelong to Melbourne in the 1850s. It was Victoria's first country main line and by far the longest railway operating in the state at the time it opened. While researching that segment, I was referring to this book, Victorian Railways to 62 by Leo J Harrigan. And it includes an account of the G&MR's grand opening day, which is a very interesting but also surprisingly tumultuous and tragic story, so I thought we'd have a quick look at that here. The G&MR completed their line between Geelong and a temporary station called Greenwich, near present-day Newport, on the 8th of June 1857. On that day, a special train ran from Geelong to Greenwich, pausing somewhere near the present site of Laverton Station for the president of the company, a Mr. Charles Nuttall Thorne, to ceremoniously fasten the last rail into place. The train then proceeded to Greenwich, where it apparently astonished residents with its peculiarly harmonious whistle. I have no idea what the 1857 populace of Newport would have considered peculiarly harmonious, or what made it stand out from other steam whistles of the time, so we'll just have to imagine. The grand public opening was held 2.5 weeks later on June 25th, and apparently the weather conditions were unfavourable. The day began with a procession through the streets of Geelong, before the Victorian Governor, Sir Henry Berkeley, and several hundred guests boarded a special train for Greenwich at 10 a.m. The trip got off to an extremely bad start when, a little over 2 miles out of Geelong, the G&MR's locomotive superintendent, a Mr. Henry Walter, leant out of the engine as it passed under a bridge and was knocked from the train and killed. However, there was important celebrating to do, and apparently this incident delayed the train no more than half an hour. The bridge in question was located roughly where the Prince's Highway still crosses the line today between North Geelong and North Shore stations, and the book mentions the nearby Ocean Child Hotel, which survived for almost another 160 years, only being demolished quite recently in 2015. The train reached Greenwich just after midday and was greeted by a crowd of 500 people who had come down from Melbourne by boat hoping to get a ride on the return trip to Geelong. But the train was already full. Apparently a band played God Save the Queen at them while they stood in the rain. It sounds like this didn't really help. As the train attempted to depart for the return trip, it was unable to gain traction on the wet rails, and the crowd sent it on its way with a push. They then stood around in the rain for 2 hours until a second train arrived, which they rode to Geelong, arriving around 4 p.m. Tired, wet, and no doubt very hungry, they made for the official opening day luncheon, to find that there was almost nothing left, as around 2,000 locals had already been through and had their fill. The book has some excellent detail of how much food was actually provided for this lunch. There was 2 3/4 tons of poultry, 2 3/4 tons of meats, 3/4 of a ton of fish and savouries, 3/4 of a ton of pastries, 1,200 weight of jellies and ices, 900 weight of fruit, 1 ton of bread, and unlimited wines, spirits, and ales, all consumed with the aid of 700 dozen of crystalware. I did some rough maths on this, and it works out at about 4.5 kilograms of food per person, so I'm not sure if they all made off with large quantities of leftovers, or if people in the 1850s were just absolute eating machines. The evening was concluded by a ball attended by 2,000 people. It's not clear if that's the same 2,000 who had eaten all the food earlier, or if the 500 people from the train joined this event, or if the unlimited drinks were still going. It's also not clear if there was another train back to Greenwich that night, or if the visitors from the city had to wait for the first regular service the next morning. The regular timetable consisted of 3 trains a day in each direction, connecting with a steamboat at Greenwich for the final leg into Melbourne. The first and last trains of the day stopped all stations at Cowie's Creek, that's the station we now know as North Shore, Duck Ponds, today's Lara, Little River, and Werribee. The middle train ran express, stopping only at Werribee for water. 3 months after the line opened, trains were redirected to a new terminus at Williamstown Pier, and in January 1859 the line was completed into Melbourne Spencer Street, today's Southern Cross, eliminating the wet part of the journey. Initially, no trains ran on Sundays, despite local demand, because the company's majority shareholders back in England were horrified by this scandalous prospect. Although by February 1859 they had given up objecting and 2 trains a day began running on Sundays. The whole trip from Geelong to Melbourne took around 2 hours, which is an average speed of about 35 kilometres per hour, suggesting a top speed somewhere towards 50. For comparison, Geelong trains today take about half that time, stopping at 9 intermediate stations, and there are now 60 trains a day in each direction in the weekday timetable. The G&MR employed a man named Job Guard as a guard. While his name was very fortunate, his employment on the railway was not, as he was killed in a shunting accident at Greenwich not long after the line opened. which was a pretty typical experience for anyone working in shunting in the 1850s. By all accounts, the G&MR was in quite a bit of financial trouble before they'd even finished building the line, and continued to lose money once operations began. At one point in 1858, they stopped paying some wages, and a group of 22 employees took legal action. This resulted in 6 first-class carriages being seized from Williamstown under warrant and sold at auction for £890. It's not clear if the G&MR bought them back or if someone else in need of 6 first-class railway carriages snapped them up. The company's situation never improved, and in June 1860 it was purchased by the government, becoming part of the newly formed Victorian Railways. The VR hired most of the G&MR's staff, but got rid of most of the apparently quite dilapidated rolling stock, and had to spend £250,000 repairing the neglected line, which had only been operating for 3 years. So that was a very brief look at the interesting bits of the history of the Geelong and Melbourne Railway Company. This story was adapted from the account given in VR to 62, which is a very interesting and detailed book on the first century and a bit of railways in Victoria. If you'd like a copy, they do come up on eBay fairly often, though usually for quite a bit of money. If you're ever organising a railway's grand opening day in the 1850s, don't forget to order more than 1,200 weight of jellies and ices. And thank you very much for watching.